Hello there, welcome back to the Chap's Guide. My name is Ash and I am your host on this journey through men's style, self-development and personal grooming. Now this morning I was reading my newspaper and a story caught my eye. It was a story about a historic wristwatch which was making its way to auction. In fact, it had just been sold for a significant amount of money. And this story of a watch, this momentous watch, which witnessed a situation in history during World War II, captured my imagination. And as today is Saturday, the 25th of June, which is designated as Armed Forces Day here in the United Kingdom, I thought it was a great opportunity to talk about that watch and its story behind it, because I think it'll be very interesting for you. Now, the watch in question is the Rolex 3525, a watch which dates back right into the 1940s. I think it was released as a piece in 1942. And this particular watch came up for sale in Christie's within the last week or so. Hence it being reported in my newspaper. So let's have a quick look at the watch, just so we understand the piece that we're talking about. So the watch in question was the top of the range Rolex for its time, and it was, as I say, the 3525 model, which was in essence a manual wind movement, 35mm, waterproof oyster case wristwatch, which had a black dial with radium treated hands, which meant that the time could be tell even in the deepest blackness of night. And it was a chronograph, so it was a forerunner to the watch which we all know today as the Rolex Cosmograph, or the Daytona, which is, of course, I think it's fair to say, the most popular wristwatch within the Rolex catalogue. And this was one of its earliest forerunners, which I believe was released into the catalogue in 1942. And I think it's a very striking piece. The sort of orange, I think it's the patination of the indices that you can see on that inky blackness of the dial make this a very attractive watch indeed. And despite it being only 35mm, which of course seems rather small in the modern era, in reality that would have been very typical of men's watches for that period. Don't forget, the Rolex Datejust was released in 1945, just 3 years later, and that was 36mm, as it persists in that size today. So way back then, you know, anything from 34 to 38mm was very typical for a man's wristwatch. Even what is in essence a tool watch like this piece that we're talking about. So I think despite its size, it looks amazing. And if it were to be reintroduced today, an updated version into the Rolex catalogue, I think it would be catapulted to the top of their sort of sales charts, because it has the look that many of us men seek. It's a tool watch, it's got interesting colours, and I think, you know, it would really draw the eye. But it doesn't matter really what's so special about the piece. It's not the watch itself. It's the person who owned the watch, as is so often the case, and the story behind them. So the person who owned this watch and who witnessed the momentous occasions in history we're about to talk about was a man called Flight Lieutenant Gerald Emerson. Now, he was a British citizen and he was a pilot in the Royal Air Force, and he was tasked with flying the Vickers Wellington bomber. Now, the Wellington bomber was a medium bomber which was pressed into service through the entirety of the Second World War. In fact, it's one of the very few bombers which was in service at the beginning of the war in 1939 and served right through to the end in 1945. And I think numerically, it was one of the largest number of bombers made for the Royal Air Force as well. So it was, you know, this aircraft was pressed into service everywhere. In fact, my wife's great uncle, a chap called Flight Sergeant Hart, he was killed in a Wellington bomber flying out of Malta on a submarine spotting mission. So even in my own family, or my wife's family, the Wellington bomber plays a part in our history. But Emerson was a pilot, and he was shot down, or his aircraft was forced to crash land near Belgium, I believe off the coast, and he was captured by German soldiers, and he was taken to a prisoner of war camp called Stalag Luft 3. Now, Stalag Luft 3 was a prisoner of war camp which has become synonymous with one particular event, which, as soon as I say it, the Great Escape, will be uppermost in your mind. Now, Stalag Luft 3 was in essence a special prisoner of war camp which was set aside for officers, so not enlisted men, for officers and people from an aviation area. So if you were a pilot or a member of aircrew and you were an officer, you would be sent to Stalag Luft 3. And at its peak, it held as many as 10,000 Allied prisoners from that sort of background. It covered around about 60 acres, so it was a large prison. And during its duration, one of the more famous prisoners who stayed there or spent some time there was Douglas Bader, one of the highest scoring fighter pilots of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. He scored 22 confirmed aerial victories. But of course, Douglas Bader was famous because he had no legs. He had lost his legs in an aviation accident prior to the war, and he came back from such a devastating injury and ended up as a fighter pilot commanding a squadron and later a wing in the Battle of Britain, where he shot down many of these enemy aircraft before he himself was shot down and found himself incarcerated in Stalag Luft 3. Now, because of his notoriety and his belligerence towards his captors, eventually he was sent to the famous Colditz prison, where escape was impossible. But Gerald Emerson found himself at Stalag Luft 3 along with many thousands of other prisoners. And of course, this is the time where the Great Escape took place, at that prison. But on his wrist, Gerald Emerson had no watch, because when he was taken into custody by his German captors, it was quite commonplace he would have been looted of his personal possessions. So if you have a knife or anything like that, obviously they'll seize that, but they'll also take wristwatches, because your captors, obviously it's the spoils of war. It'll be seen as a trophy by the soldiers who take you into custody. But also there would have been the concern by his captors that perhaps the watch was hiding something like a hidden compass or something which could be used in an escape attempt. So they would have all been confiscated. And this was the case for all of the prisoners. However, this is where somebody we all know and love, particularly if you like Rolex watches, and today I'm wearing my classic Rolex Submariner. But Hans Wilsdorf came to the aid of all of these officers who had no watch, because he was an interesting character. Obviously, he was born a German. He was born in territory which was part of the Imperial German Empire at the time of his birth. But he moved to London, as we know. He founded the Rolex watch company, not called that back then, but it later became Rolex, with his partner Alfred Davis, and eventually it morphed into Rolex and ended up in Geneva in Switzerland. But Hans Wilsdorf was an Anglophile. He loved Britain and all things British, which is evident in the legacies which he has left us, because a lot of people don't realise that the crown, which is the brand logo of Rolex, is actually Hans Wilsdorf's sort of homage to the crown of the British monarchy. And the sister brand of Rolex, also founded by Wilsdorf, Tudor, gets its name because Tudor is obviously one of the royal houses of the British monarchy. So you could see he was quite an Anglophile and a patriotic individual. So knowing that our officers in the prisoner of war camps wouldn't have had a wristwatch, he let it be known that should they contact him in Switzerland, send him a postcard and let them know of their circumstances, I am in such and such a prison and I would like this particular watch, he would send them the watch of their choice. This seems to have been accepted and overlooked by the German captors. So you could send off for a watch, and Wilsdorf would send the watch to the prisoner of war camp with the assistance of the Royal Red Cross, who obviously provided care packages and the like for prisoners of war. And you would not be expected to pay for that watch until you were released from custody and were in a position to reimburse Rolex. So in essence, Hans Wilsdorf extended a line of credit to all pilots who were in custody with German prisoner of war camps. They could choose the watch of their choice, and then he would send it along. It would take some time, maybe up to a year, to get back to you. But then when you get released from prison, you're on your honour to pay that money back. And it's a remarkable fact that the vast majority of military officers who took up that offer from Hans Wilsdorf all paid up their debt at the end of the war. Very few didn't, and I think it would be fair to say that perhaps those who didn't maybe lost their lives and were not in a position to sort out their debt. But what an amazing offer by Hans Wilsdorf. It's not something he had to do, it's something he chose to do. And Gerald Imerson took up that option, and he sent off for the piece, the 3525, this chronograph watch, which we see here. And he wasn't doing anything by half measures, because this was certainly one of the top of the range Rolex watches in the catalogue of the time. So not for him was anything cheap and cheerful or one of the lower end models. He went for the best watch in the collection, and that's what he got. He eventually ended up with his 3525. Now, Flight Lieutenant Imerson, Gerald, was a part of that very famous event called The Great Escape, which was immortalised by the 1963 film starring such greats as Steve McQueen and Richard Attenborough and James Garner, which was all around the attempted escape from that prison camp by many of those pilots who were incarcerated there. And the story, and I'll summarise quickly, goes a bit like this. So all of these prisoners were in the camp. And of course it is the duty, the sworn duty, of any prisoner of war, particularly an officer who is a leader of course, to do all they can to make best efforts to escape from that camp. To get back to their own lines, to continue participating in the war, yes of course, but if they become bothersome for their captors who have to deploy more resources to keep them incarcerated safely, it means resources are being diverted from the front line. So it's their sworn duty, and they decide to attempt an escape, and they decide to try and tunnel out from Stalag Luft 3. And of course famously in the novel initially and in the film in due course in 1963, the three tunnels which are dug by the prisoners are called Tom, Dick and Harry. And over a period of months, the soldiers, working always in a clandestine nature, bore out these tunnels under the lines and under the fences of the prisoner of war camp. They had to move something like 200 tons of sand and soil in the process of creating these tunnels. And they came to a point in March of, let me just check, when was it? I think it was something like 1944, when they were ready to attempt their escape. So the tunnels are dug and the men are getting ready to escape. They all have their uniforms recut into a civilian fashion so they look like the civilians out in the countryside for when they escape. They all have forged papers so that they can try and pass through enemy checkpoints. And they all draw lots because, of course, not everybody can get through the tunnel and get out and run away. It's all done in a very orderly fashion. You draw lots. If you're number one, you're the first person out, you run off and you escape in whatever plan you're making. So we know that Gerald Imerson drew a lot, and he was number 172. So he was underground in that tunnel waiting for his turn, waiting for the searchlights to swing by and then for the guys to be told up and out, and off they would go, run into the woods and attempt to make their escape. Of course, he would have been there in that tunnel wearing his Rolex 3525, that radium-treated hands and dial, displaying for him the time, because time would have been so important to these men waiting to escape. You know, they have their time slot, they know when the guards are going past. Time is vital. And he would have been one of the timekeepers with his wonderful, fabulous chronograph Rolex. And of course, we all know what happens if we've seen the movie. When the 77th prisoner breaks cover and runs away, he is spotted by the guards, and the escape attempt has to stop. So unfortunately, Gerald Imeson does not get to escape. I say unfortunately because it wasn't a happy ending to this story. Of the 77 men who rendered their escape, only 3 actually made it to the safety of a neutral territory or back to the lines of their own country. 2 Norwegians and 1 Dutchman. All of the others were captured. And of those who were recaptured, this absolutely incensed Adolf Hitler, who gave a personal instruction that all of the airmen were to be killed as a reprisal, to be executed. Some sort of remonstration was made to the Führer by some of the German generals who believed that, you know, if they started executing Allied prisoners, this might reflect poorly on German prisoners in Allied custody. So the instruction was given that 50 of the recaptured prisoners were to be executed. And indeed that was the case. They were taken away and they were summarily executed by their German captors. In essence, they were murdered because it was a non-judicial killing. It was against the instructions of the Geneva Convention, and in fact the perpetrators of this heinous atrocity after the war were tracked down, brought to justice. Many received a death sentence and were themselves executed for their part in that atrocity, and others received life sentences in prison. So it was a very tragic event, and I think perhaps Gerald Imeson was fortunate that, you know, he did not break cover and end up running off and escaping. But it's a fabulous story of people who are not prepared to just sit back and let the war go on without them. They know their sworn duty, and they undertook to, you know, facilitate their escape and cause the Germans problems. And certainly they paid the ultimate price in that process. So what happens to Gerald? Well, with the ending of the war, actually he survived, and he was lucky to survive because as the camp was actually in Poland, Stalag Luft 3, and as the Soviets approached at the end of the war, the Germans forced all the prisoners on a forced march back to or within the boundaries of Germany. In fact, many prisoners did not survive, but Gerald did. He survived and he was repatriated to Great Britain, and he went on to have a long and happy life. He had a family and he lived to the age of 85 when he eventually passed in, I believe it was 2003. So all of his life he treasured that Rolex watch, which was provided for him by Hans Wilsdorf way back in the 1940s, and went with him and played such a pivotal part during the Great Escape. Now, his watch was sold in 2013. The first time, and you know, I don't know who owned it at that time, but recently it came up for resale in Christie's in the last week or so, and the watch was sold for 150,000 British pounds, which is approximately 189,000 US dollars. So absolutely, you know, is it worth it? Every single penny. In fact, when I think of some of these iconic watches, which we hear raising huge amounts of money when they're auctioned, you know, and the thing which springs to mind perhaps most of all is that Paul Newman Cosmograph, the Daytona, the Panda Daytona, which is so famous and so worshipped by watch lovers and collectors today. His watch, Paul Newman's actual watch, raised millions of pounds when it was auctioned. But what really was that watch? It was a mass-produced watch, which only fame was because it was owned by a Hollywood movie star, a multi-millionaire, somebody whose life was luxury and wonder. Gerald Imeson's watch is very different. Its story is fantastic. It was supplied through the generosity of Hans Wilsdorf to these incarcerated Allied prisoners of war, on their honour that they would pay up their bill when they were released, if they survived. And of course most of them did. And this particular watch was a witness to this historical escape from Stalag Luft 3, the great escape. So I think if it comes to the apportioning of financial value to a significantly historical watch, it is this 3525 chronograph, which I would think would be worth millions, opposed to the watch of a movie star. But there we go, it shows the time that we live in. And if you want to see how wristwatch values have risen, well, a similar watch to the one which was owned by Gerald was sold by Christie's in, let me think, 2002. It was the same model. It was indeed the 3525 chronograph watch, supplied under the same circumstances, but on this occasion to an officer called Lieutenant Robert Douglas. That watch sold for a mere £11,000 20 years ago. The same watch, or the same type of watch, supplied in the same situation, sold, I remind you, for £150,000 last week. So, it just goes to show. I think the reason why watches are so emblematic of history for us men is that, of course, we don't have the luxury like ladies do of having jewellery that we typically carry and passes from generation to generation. A wristwatch is a tangible piece of quasi-jewellery, perhaps the only piece of quasi-jewellery that men wear. It's the only semi-bit of jewellery I wear. I wear no other items of jewellery at all. Don't even wear a wedding ring despite being married. So the watch for me is the only sort of tangible thing which touches my skin, which is a part of me. I strap it onto my body every day and it becomes really a part of my psyche. And I think this is why us men are so invested in our timepieces. Women, I think, by and large, don't get it when it comes to wristwatches. They'd much rather a diamond ring. My own wife is a point in question. But for me, I think the story of a watch is very, very special. And this one really brought it home to me. And today, of course, is Veterans Day, Armed Forces Day here in the United Kingdom. So for me, it's a special day, and I'll be thinking about Gerald Emerson and the men like him who did so much for us that we may sit here today and talk about fripperies like wristwatches. If it were not for people like him, this luxury would not be afforded us at all. So on that note, I will leave you today. I will wish you well, and I will look forward to seeing you again very soon.